3, 2, 1. Hello everybody, my name is Alex and welcome to a video where we have a look at some of the history behind our recent kind of episodes of Civilization 6 as Scotland. So today we're going to be looking at the Viking relationship in Scotland, how they were there, what they did, and then we're going to move on to have a quick look at the Great Library. Two things which are really kind of unconnected, but I think it works quite well to have a look at a little bit of history instead of really strongly focusing on one subject. So yeah, let's get on with that. As always, if there's anything you'd think I should have mentioned, although I've gave quite a brief overview, so there is a lot I've missed out, and then let me know in the comments. Yeah, so anyway, let's start with the Vikings. So before we begin, it's important to note the primary sources for the Viking presence in Scotland, especially in the early years, are weak and can be contradictory. This is something we see throughout history. Depending on who's writing it, depending on their perspective, they often write very, very different things. The 8th century, where our story begins, is not a period of excessive written accounts either. It's sadly the opposite. There's very little written, and as I said, a lot of it can be contradictory. Hence why writing any form of historical essay as a research piece or etc. Can be particularly difficult on subjects such as this. I know my friend wanted to do the Vikings for his dissertation at uni, and he's going to struggle to do that. So for this video I used quite a few sources. I largely draw on Wikipedia for things like this. I know it's not very academic, but you know it's still useful, and that's what it's there for. I used other websites, but they'll all be left down in the description below. So here's a very, very brief overview of the Vikings, or Scandinavians, in Scotland. So from the 8th to the 15th century, Scandinavians, largely Norwegians, who is the civilization we just met on our Rise and Fall playthrough, settled on and influenced the kingdom which we now refer to as Scotland. The written records suggest the Scandinavians first arrived in Scotland in the late 8th century, although they almost certainly arrived before. Hence we've got this kind of gap in written accounts, because people just before didn't write about it. So when they settled on the outskirts, so they settled on the outskirts of the Scottish lands. They held significant territory in places such as Shetland and the Orkneys, as we were saying, territories on the edge of Scotland. Unsurprisingly, as a result of this, early conflicts occurred between the Scandinavians and the Scottish kingdoms, such as Alba, with the Norwegian crown often becoming involved. This is a theme which goes on. We're not going to talk about it too much, but there's often conflicts between the Norwegians, kind of the Scandinavians, and the native Scotlands, as you'd expect. So although much of the territory the Vikings held during this period was on the outskirts of Scotland, at times the Scandinavians did press into the mainland of Scotland. During the reign of, wait for it, Thorfinn Sigurdsson, I think that was a pretty decent attempt at pronouncing that, during the 11th century, the Scandinavians pushed well into mainland Scotland. From the 13th century onwards, however, the Scandinavians they lost influence within Scotland, and by the 15th century it all but disappeared, with lands such as Orkney and Shetland being transferred to Scottish rule. So kind of the Vikings were there from at least the 8th century, probably before, and they were there for 7 centuries. So that's pretty decent. That's a reasonable amount of time to be there. Perhaps unsurprising, because Scotland is quite close to the Scandinavian nations. But yeah. So, interestingly, when researching this, and there's a bit of an overview of what they actually did, a common theme of the Viking reality is present in Scotland, as it is around much of Europe during this time. Many people consider the Vikings as solely violent people. I'm sure you recognise that from kind of TV, etc., who focused mainly on kind of raiders and violence. Instead, if you look at this in more detail, the Vikings did a lot of trading, and as we can see from them settling on the islands such as Orkney, etc., they were also settlers and colonisers. So there were traders, there were colonisers, and something which is very interesting, they were arguably the first people to discover America, so they were explorers as well, but that's something we can go into at a different time. So just as much as they were raiders and murderers and these violent people, they also kind of did a lot of trade, which is to be expected. Anyway, so that is a very brief overview of the Vikings. We're now going to go on and talk about the Great Library wonder which we built in Civilization 6, and we're going to have a look at some of the basics of that now. For this section, I've drawn largely upon like Encyclopedia Britannica entry on the Great Library. I've also had a look at the Civilization Bibliography entry and also at Wikipedia and things like that, just to get a basic idea of the very basics of the Great Library and some of the interesting facts around it. So the library was formed as part of the Research Institute of the Alexandria, which is a city in Egypt. There's lots of cities around, I think, called Alexandria, because as Alexander the Great went around kind of the Mediterranean, in Egypt more specifically, capturing territory, he founded lots of cities called Alexandria. Or Alexander, you know what I mean, because he's called Alexander, which is a good name, by the way. So it was founded by Demetrius Phaleris, I think that's roughly how you pronounce his name. This is the library I'm talking about. And he was a student of Aristotle's during the reign of Ptolemy I of Sota. Interestingly, Ptolemy was a Macedonian general of Alexander the Great who became ruler of Egypt from 323 to 285 BC. I always get confused with the dates because they're like backwards, and he was also founder of his own dynasty, which lasted pretty much the longest of all Alexander's general dynasties that were founded. But that's just a random interesting fact. So the original collection of the Great Library of Alexandria was said to be built on the works of Aristotle, but through times the rulers of Egypt and Alexandria became obsessed with expanding its collection, while certain ones did, some were more bothered than others. The library's holdings eventually reached between 400 and 700,000 scrolls and various other vellum codices. Vellum is essentially a prepared animal skin which can be written on, so it's kind of like a scroll but a bit different. The responsibility for the fire which eventually destroyed the library largely differs. So some sources suggest there was a big fire, and some suggest it was troops of the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar, and that they accidentally burnt the library during the siege of Alexandria, whereas other sources point to a longer-term decline of the library, 800 years long in fact. By the 5th century it is largely accepted though that the library's collection had been almost completely eradicated. The story of the library is both sad because it's such a large amount of knowledge that was just lost over time, but it's also kind of fascinating that if you think about it, it's like the internet almost. It's like an old-fashioned internet. There was so much knowledge and so many scrolls there. It's absolutely fascinating to think all the information and knowledge which the library possessed, and it's so sad that it's not kind of around today for us to actually physically look back at. But that's just a little bit of history and a couple of things I wanted to pick up from the Civilization series. I think I'm going to do these every couple of episodes and just pick out some interesting topics and learn some facts on them. Maybe a more laid back approach is more appropriate for the series, and we'll see how that goes. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Please do leave me a like if you've learned something and you found it interesting. Also leave me in the comments down below what you think of the video, if I've missed anything crucial out, what you'd have added, or if you've just got any more information you'd like to share. So thank you for watching, hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you in the next episode of this.